Snow fell in slow, stubborn sheets. The morning the armored column rolled into Honsfeld. The trees wore white ruffs. The narrow Belgian lanes were glazed with ice, and the world smelled of damp wool and diesel. For men who had lived on a diet of cold metal and colder orders, the sight of a deserted American supply point gleaming behind its low sandbags felt like a miracle. Trucks knocked askew, tents sagging, canvas flaps frozen in mid-ripple, and barrels, endless ranks of them, stacked like a line of sleeping animals. Joachim Peiper, an SS Standartenführer known for his brutality and his punch-first, ask-questions-later style of command, walked among the crates and drums as if counting prayers. When the numbers were totaled, the figure that met his eyes was simple, obscene, and, for a desperate moment, intoxicating. Roughly 50,000 gallons of fuel. Enough on paper to push his Kampfgruppe farther and faster than any week of Nazi logistics had allowed. That number hung in the cold like a promise. But numbers in war are not the same as futures. Peiper had been given orders that depended on a geography of speed, to break through, seize the bridges, and push to the Meuse. The plan for the Ardennes offensive, Operation Wacht am Rhein, was audacious to the point of desperation, founded on the brittle assumption that mechanized units could bite a chunk out of Allied lines and that, as they advanced, they would feed themselves on the enemy's stockpiles. German logistical planning in late 1944 had become a patchwork of hope. Synthetic fuel plants were sputtering from Allied air attacks. Refineries had been hammered, and rail and road networks were collapsing under the strain of retreat and bombardment. Hitler's strategists had priced the operation not in raw gasoline alone, but in a single gamble, that capturing Allied depots would carry the offensive forward. For a few hours among stacked drums in Honsfeld, that gamble looked like it might pay off. Walking past the barrels, Peiper must have felt the old bravado of a commander who had seen blitzkrieg work before. Thin columns of steel, a sharp thrust, the world yielding. The reality, however, had teeth. The captured fuel did not come as a neat logistical package with supply clerks and manifests. It came under the ragged circumstances of retreat. Spoilt or partially drained drums, pumps frozen in place. Not all of it fit for the high-compression engines of Panther and Tiger. Much of it improvised for lesser machines. His drivers, men with chapped cheeks and the tremor of cold in their palms, knew the difference between hope and horsepower. They siphoned, they jury-rigged, they coaxed engines back to life with wire and prayer. The captured fuel would move a few tanks, a handful of half-tracks, maybe a short burst of momentum down a slick road. It was a temporary grace, not a structural cure. The broader picture of Germany's petroleum problem by December 1944 reads like a ledger of gradual attrition. Allied strategic bombing, systematic and relentless since 1943, had focused on output hubs, synthetic plants, refineries, storage tanks, and the transportation that bound them together. By autumn, German production of petroleum, oil, and lubricants had nosedived. Some plants produced only fragments of their former output, and the Luftwaffe, whose operations had once been sustained by domestic aviation gasoline, found itself clipped. The Germans attempted countermeasures, camouflage, dispersal, night production shifts, but the cumulative effect of months of air raids and interdiction meant that even if local officers like Peiper stumbled upon enemy supplies, the German army's capacity to mobilize and replenish at scale was broken. Allied documents and post-war analyses would later show that the oil campaign had effectively starved the Wehrmacht of the fuel it required to be mechanized and mobile. What Peiper's discovery represented was not salvation, but an ephemeral reprieve. Peiper's column moved out from Honsfeld with the drums strapped into frozen trucks, and with the grinding hope that a surge of fuel could make the difference between a tactical blunder and strategic success. For a few hours, the column found the strange equilibrium war sometimes grants, enemy resistance slack, roads clear of the usual chaos, the sky a hard, pale dome that kept aircraft grounded. The men felt it, the peculiar elation that comes when mechanics find a fix, when engines cough awake and a road opens. They drove west under a sky like hammered pewter, through villages blackened by shells, past hedgerows like the ribs of a drowned ship. Yet even as the convoy rolled, the arithmetic of the campaign nibbled at their edges, traffic jams forming where narrow lanes funneled the armored behemoths. Supply lorries snarled and abandoned, the cold making rubber brittle and human hands clumsy. The 50,000 gallons were being spent even as they reveled in them. A candle burned to see the dark for a moment longer. If the Ardennes gamble had any fatal weakness, it was not simply the weather or the bravery of men in foxholes. It was logistics. German units had to stretch an already thin network of fuel across an advancing spearhead, and the farther they pushed, the thinner that thread became. Allied bombing had struck not only production, but transport. Marshalling yards and rail centers that carried oil from plant to front were vulnerable. By design or by necessity, the German plan treated captured fuel as a consumable resource to be swallowed and burned in the engine rooms of the advance. But in the cold arithmetic of mechanized warfare, the quantity seized at Honsfeld was a drop in a vast ocean of need. It could accelerate vehicles for perhaps a day or two. It could not reverse the long-term hemorrhage inflicted by nearly a year of sustained Allied interdiction. Peiper may have felt, as many commanders do when their men are fed but their strategy is not, that a prize had been won for a cause already in decline. The gamble to seize fuel was bound to human stories. Men searching sacks for canned coffee, sergeants doling out the precious few liters like sacrament, the muffled profanity of drivers who watched a tank cough and die on a frozen slope. Yet the strategic reality crept through those small scenes as inevitably as frost through a window pane. High command could not fashion synthetic miles out of captured drums. For all their audacity, the Germans were fighting a war whose backbone had been sawed at by the sustained Allied air campaign and the collapse of Axis-controlled oil fields in Romania. As the columns pushed, reports filtered back, bridges blown behind them, flank units stalled by mud and snow, the Luftwaffe impotent in the low cloud. Peiper's caches were the kind of boon that could change a battle's texture for a day, not the kind that could alter the war's trajectory. A field full of drums is not a factory. In a sense, the 50,000 gallons became a metaphor for the last months of the Third Reich. Sudden, glittering gains that masked deep structural losses. Historians have argued that the Ardennes offensive was as much political theater as military operation, a desperate bid to force a negotiated settlement or to split the Western Allies. The Germans had exceptional armored formations and daring leaders. Yet where before bold movement had been the instrument of victory, now bold movement required the quiet, unglamorous plumbing of supply. Peiper's men, who had been raised to prize the offensive spirit, were now forced into an economy of scarcity. Each liter burned was an answer to a question whose true complexity lay far beyond the reach of any platoon or Kampfgruppe. The captured drums would be poured into tanks that would, within days, be stranded or abandoned when roads froze, engines seized, or counterattacks severed their lines. There is an irony in the way a military leader's revelation often comes not from doctrine, but from touch. Seeing how a soldier's face falls when a truck's engine refuses to turn, smelling the acrid tang of oil burnt to keep a turret turning, watching a half-track sink into a mud hole because horses and manpower had to pull the rest. Peiper, surrounded by the gritty calculus of his unit's needs, could count barrels and men. What he could not count, at least not in the moment, were the cumulative effects of strategic bombing, resource denial, and the opening of multiple fronts against a regime that had already been stretched to breaking. Some commanders, historians note, recognized this sooner than others. Some clung to the short-term proofs of courage and capture. For Peiper, the discovery in Honsfeld was at once a tactical boon and a dangerous illusion. The tanks licked at the road like hungry dogs, but the pack was starving. 2 weeks after Honsfeld, radio chatter and battered dispatches told a story that the drums at the depot could not silence. German armored strength was bleeding away. Fuel reserves, even in 1944's last quarters, were a mosaic of diminishing fields and denied pipelines. The Americans and the RAF resumed control of the skies as weather improved, hunting columns on roadways, attacking rear depots, and transforming the fragile gains into pyres of wrecked vehicles. The Ardennes offensive, for which Hitler and his generals had pinned so much hope on local successes, and the seizure of supplies, found itself outrun by reality. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, once a spearhead that promised to cleave to the Meuse, was hemmed in and eventually forced to abandon heavy equipment in their attempt to break back to German lines. The captured fuel, burned to fuel a doomed push, lit the way toward an obvious truth. Tactical success cannot substitute for strategic sustainment. There is cruelty in hindsight. Historians can map the campaign's supply chains and point, with cold precision, to the factories that no longer produced, to the rail hubs wrecked by bombs, to the Romanian oil fields slipping from Axis control after the summer of 1944. Yet for those in the frozen forests, drivers, gunners, clerks, history is not a ledger, but a sequence of small, palpable losses. A ration canister gone, a radio that will not tune, an engine that will not catch. Peiper, who had been raised in an officer corps that valued decisiveness, must have felt those losses as both immediate and existential. You could win a skirmish, the Ardennes seemed to whisper, but you could not win the thing the war had become. An industrial struggle over fuel, steel, and manpower that had been decided long before the snow fell. The 50,000 gallons were a single chapter in a book someone else had written. What makes this moment worth dwelling on is not simply the drama of capture, but the lesson it embodies about modern war. Mobility is not merely a matter of iron and audacity, it is an expression of a nation's ability to clothe those engines in fuel, to keep rails running and factories humming. The German army of 1944 still had the men who could fight, and the commanders who could direct. What it lacked was the energy economy to sustain their movement at scale. Allied interdiction, air raids, sabotage, and the steady loss of resources had engineered a slow-motion strangulation. When Peiper stood among the drums at Honsfeld and noted 50,000 gallons, he was not merely counting liters. He was, perhaps without naming it, counting the years of production the Reich had lost. In the silent arithmetic of supply, the future already leaned toward the Allies. There are moments in war when small choices crystallize into moral and historical choices. Peiper's detour to seize fuel was one such decision, an operational deviation with cascading consequences. It is well documented that Kampfgruppe Peiper deviated from assigned routes on multiple occasions, sometimes to seize perceived opportunities, sometimes under pressure from the fog of war. Those detours brought short-term gains, prisoners, weapons, and, at Honsfeld, fuel. Yet they also exposed units to counterattack, diverted momentum from strategic axes, and, in Peiper's case, linked his name to some of the more notorious crimes of the Ardennes, crimes that ensured his legend would be bound to brutality, as much as to courage. The captured fuel, then, sits in history's ledger next to darker entries, a tactical boon shaded by the moral and strategic failures that accompanied it. The narrative's end is not a single heroic picture, but a staggered human geometry. Men moving through snow, engines coughing, commanders tallying gains against losses, and the slow realization that the architecture of war had shifted away from Germany. When historians like Antony Beevor and Max Hastings lay down the map of late 1944, they show a regime whose capacity to field mechanized force had been crippled by sustained strategic pressure. They show how even daring operations like the Ardennes could not close the gap created by months of bombing and attrition. Peiper's seized barrels were a footnote in a larger collapse, but they are a resonant footnote. Proof that even when frontline initiative produced success, the higher-order systems that sustain war had failed. The 50,000 gallons, once a bright hope, became fuel for a funeral pyre of momentum. If there is a quiet moral in this scene, it is not moral at all, but a practical truth about warfare in the 20th century. Industry and logistics are the real front lines. Men will fight bravely for weeks on little more than belief. But the engine that drives armies is not courage alone. It is the steady, invisible flow of materials. Peiper's moment at Honsfeld offered theater and irony in equal measure. A man surrounded by the very commodity his command needed to be decisive, yet surrounded as well by the evidence that the machinery of the Reich had been fundamentally compromised. He could use the fuel to push forward. He could not manufacture the factories that made it. The Ardennes would, for a moment, tremble under the weight of that decision, and then, inevitably, it would settle back into the long arc of defeat. There is a sound to last stands and failed gambles, the hollow, repeated clatter of abandoned gear, the distant thunk of artillery growing muted as units pull back, the quiet after the planes return to the skies. In the aftermath of Peiper's advance, after vehicles were left, men were cut off, and the columns that had taken Honsfeld were eventually halted. The captured fuel had been consumed or left behind. The war rolled on, indifferent to the small victories that had cost everything. For the men who had siphoned drums in the frozen light, for the sergeant who had watched a tank die because the wrong grade of fuel had been used, the realization was visceral. There was no long-term salvation in captured barrels. For historians, the lesson is clearer. The fate of nations in modern war often depends on the unseen pipelines and refineries whose destruction unfits frontline courage for strategic victory. At the edge of memory and record, personal reckonings blur with official ones. Peiper's capture of 50,000 gallons is a stark image, a small triumph, a fleeting oasis in a campaign built on overreach. It also stands as a hinge, one of many, that swings the story from bold maneuver to inevitable collapse. Germany's doom in late 1944 was not a single moment, but a concatenation. Factories struck, transport collapsed, fuel dwindled, and ambitious offensives were grounded in arithmetic they could not satisfy. In the frozen Ardennes, among the barrels and the frozen pumps, a colonel could count gallons and imagine victory. He could not count the months of replenishment his nation had already lost. The captured fuel illuminated a truth the Reich could not absorb. Courage might win battles, but only industry could win wars. History, when it is told well, does not end with tidy morals, but with the lingering image that refuses to leave the mind. Picture Peiper turning away from the stacked drums as dawn lowered like a black curtain, the men around him rubbing their hands and stealing chances at warmth, the engines idling like a restless animal that would not be fed for long. He had found salvation in a pile of barrels. He had tasted the possibility of breaking out of the frozen trap. But, as the lines of fuel trace out into used miles, as the Luftwaffe failed to secure the skies and Allied air power resumed its suffocating campaign, as factories that made that fuel lay silent or in ruins, the human eye can see the larger arc. 50,000 gallons is an answer to a question that had already been decided. The colonel's realization, simple, bitter, and unavoidable, was not that his men had been brave, but that bravery without fuel is motion without destination. The war moved on, the drums were burned, and history advanced toward its inevitable close. By January 1945, the snow that once blanketed the Ardennes had turned gray with soot and the ash of burned fuel. The thunder of engines that once echoed through the hills had faded to a scattered rhythm, sporadic, broken, a few isolated tanks grinding through drifts that swallowed roads whole. For Peiper and his men, the war had become a slow unraveling. The 50,000 gallons that once promised momentum had been spent, traded for distance measured not in miles gained, but in hours survived. The men were now moving on foot, cold creeping into their joints, hunger setting their stomachs against them. Tanks that had once carried the pride of a mechanized Reich now stood frozen in silence, their tracks half buried, their turrets crusted in ice. The captured fuel was gone, and with it went the illusion that boldness could outrun collapse. Those who survived the retreat would remember it less as a march, and more as an abandonment. Villages like Le Glaise and Stoumont became names spoken in a low tone among veterans, places where fuel had run dry, where vehicles were torched to deny them to the enemy, where men clung to the hope of relief that never came. In Le Glaise, Peiper ordered his remaining tanks destroyed, their ammunition spent or scattered, their metal carcasses left to rust in snow like tombstones of an era that had burned itself to ash. The villagers would later remember the night sky colored by the flames of German armor, the crackle of exploding fuel, and the strange stillness that followed. For those men who had driven west on stolen fuel, it was the end of a dream born of desperation. As the Allies closed in, Peiper's column splintered. Men dropped into the woods, their breath turning to vapor in the cold, rifles clutched without ammunition, uniforms stiff with frost. They moved east, guided by instinct more than maps, their formation broken, but their will to survive intact. Some were captured. Others disappeared into the forest, ghosts of a machine that had run dry. When Peiper finally reached German lines, he was no longer the commander of an armored spearhead, but the leader of a ragged band, hollow-eyed and starving, his vehicles left behind like discarded relics. The man who had once commanded fire and steel was now walking, step after slow step, through the wreckage of his own advance. The realization must have sunk deep, that Germany's war machine, once so formidable, had been reduced to men trudging through snow, running not on fuel, but on faith that had long since frozen over. Meanwhile, in Allied headquarters, the reports of captured fuel dumps told another story. American officers reviewing the aftermath of the Ardennes offensive noted how critical fuel shortages had been to halting the German advance. Eisenhower himself remarked that Germany's reliance on captured supplies revealed the depth of its desperation. Allied analysts later confirmed that even if every gallon at Honsfeld had been successfully used, it would have extended German armored operations by no more than 2 days. That was the math of modern war, cold, simple, and absolute. Fuel was no longer just a resource, it was time. Germany had run out of both. Back in Germany, the news from the Ardennes carried an undertone of disbelief. Propaganda had promised a breakthrough, a new miracle on the Western Front. But in reality, Operation Wacht am Rhein had bled the last reserves of men and material the Reich could muster. factories bombed beyond repair, rail networks shattered, refineries silent. The arteries of an empire had closed. Peiper's 50,000 gallons, once a symbol of audacity, now stood as proof that the German war effort was surviving on scavenged scraps. Hitler's gamble had turned into a funeral procession for the Wehrmacht's last offensive capability. For the first time, even loyal officers whispered the unthinkable. Germany could no longer fight a modern war. By spring, Allied tanks rolled through the same roads that Peiper had once thundered down. The snow was gone, replaced by mud and the acrid scent of rusting armor. Villagers came out to see the wrecks that littered the hills, panthers and half-tracks blackened and split open, barrels still standing in neat rows where Peiper's men had first found them. Some were punctured by shrapnel, others frozen solid, but most were empty. In the silence of that thawing landscape, it was easy to imagine the ghosts of those who had passed through, men who had believed that 50,000 gallons could change the course of a war already lost. The empty drums stood as monuments to futility, to courage wasted by the math of exhaustion. Historians who later reconstructed the Battle of the Bulge would point to that captured fuel not as a turning point, but as an emblem. The German army had not lost because its soldiers fought poorly. It lost because its empire had no blood left to pump through its veins. Every tank in the Ardennes was a borrowed hour, every shell an echo of industry that no longer existed. The oil war had been the quiet executioner of the Reich. By the time Peiper was counting barrels in Honsfeld, Germany's fate had already been sealed in the smoke of Ploiești's burning oil fields and the rubble of Leuna,'s shattered hydrogenation plants. The colonel might not have known it then, but his discovery was not the sign of a resurgence. It was the tombstone of mechanized blitzkrieg. And yet, within that decay, there was something deeply human, a kind of tragic dignity in men who refused to surrender even when the elements themselves seemed to conspire against them. They were soldiers fighting not for victory, but for survival, carrying the remnants of a nation's illusion across a frozen landscape. Peiper, for all his ruthlessness, was a man bound by the logic of a system that had already collapsed. In his eyes, perhaps, those barrels at Honsfeld still shimmered with the faint hope that Germany's miracle weapons, its whispered wonder solutions, might still turn the tide. But miracles require miracles to sustain them, and fuel, real, tangible fuel, was the one thing the Reich could no longer conjure. As the months passed, the world learned the full cost of Germany's final gamble. The Ardennes offensive claimed nearly 100,000 German casualties, men lost not just to bullets, but to frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion. Of Peiper's original 5,000 men, fewer than 800 made it back to German lines. The 50,000 gallons had burned brightly, but like all fire fed by desperation, it had consumed more than it sustained. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the war's closing images were not of sweeping offensives or triumphant marches, but of empty roads, idle tanks, and men walking east beneath the pale light of defeat. Years later, historians would return to those same roads in the Ardennes. They would stand among rusted wrecks and silent forests and try to trace the path of a column that had once carried the last hopes of a dying empire. And they would see, in that moment when a German colonel stood among barrels of stolen fuel and imagined salvation, the final irony of the Third Reich, that even its boldest acts of defiance had become monuments to its collapse. The Reich that had sought to conquer through movement ended in stillness. The machines that had carried it forward now lay entombed in mud, their bellies empty, their promise spent. In the end, history remembers Peiper's capture of 50,000 gallons not as triumph, but as revelation, the moment when the illusion of victory cracked, and through it, the truth shone cold and merciless. The fuel that once roared through German engines now rests in the pages of war's archives, its measure recorded not in gallons, but in the final, fleeting moments it bought for an empire already doomed. The war had begun with steel, with motion, with the roar of engines across Europe. It ended here, in the silence of the Ardennes, with empty barrels and the sound of snow melting over rust.